Today's lesson is looking at an introduction to economics. So looking at what is economics, how we measure economic growth, and some limitations to that measurement of GDP or economic growth. The next couple of weeks we'll be looking at economics more in depth. So what is economics? Economics can be defined as the social science that seeks to describe the factors which determine the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. It's a study of how people choose to use resources. So resources, these can include time, money, minerals, and goods and services. So given all that, economics looks at how markets react to certain decisions made by different groups of people, including you, me, businesses, and the government, for example. So it's a study of how people choose to use resources and the impacts that those decisions have on people and markets. Why do economies need to grow? Every day you use goods and services. Think of the things you use on a daily basis. Bread for breakfast, a bus or train service to get to school, pens and paper to complete your homework, electricity for charging your laptop. All these things are going to need to be used tomorrow. So for this reason, we need to replace what has been consumed in a market. So that's one of the reasons why we must grow each year. We need to replace what we've been used, and there's some also other reasons. So for instance, population growth. If you and I are just replacing what we use, the new people who come into Australia, for instance through immigration or through birth, they need to require additional goods and services. The desire to continually improve the quality of products is another reason. So imagine if producers never improved telecommunications, mobile phones and the internet would have not been invented. So economies need to grow to be able to provide resources for those quality of products to be improved. So economic growth. Economic growth is defined as real growth in the value of goods and services produced by an economy over a period of time. Economic growth occurs when an economy increases the volume of goods and services produced over a period of time. Now, we use a term called GDP, which is the gross domestic product. This is the most commonly used general measure of economic growth. GDP represents the total market value of final goods and services produced by a country over a period of time. So generally measured over a year, GDP measures the difference between the total value of goods and services produced in Australia from the previous year. And if that's grown, we can say that the economy has grown, GDP has increased. If that value is decreased, more than likely people aren't spending as much and you might be in a market downturn. Here's our equation for gross domestic product. So GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. We're about to have a look at what that equation means. Here it is again. C is our consumer spending. Okay, you and I, spending by individuals, households and businesses on goods and services. So what are we spending our money in? Clothes, things for the house. That goes towards GDP. I stands for investment. So investment expenditure. So what are we spending our money on that are investments, such as computers, houses, factories and machinery that can go towards producing other goods and services. G stands for government expenditure. Now it's broken up into G1 and G2 here, but I'm just going to leave it as G. G1 and G2 cover all of the G sector. So it's spending by the government, whether that's going towards our roads, healthcare, education, things like that. Okay, expenditure on exports, so spending by households, businesses and governments that are overseas on goods and services produced in Australia. So for instance, China buying products from us, that might be minerals, such as iron ore to go towards their economy. So if they're buying things from us, that's included as exports. M stands for imports. So what are we spending our money on that's coming from another country? For example, if we're buying goods and services from China, that would be included in imports. So to work out the value that's going to go towards the GDP, it's the total value of exports minus imports. That gives us that figure. So all you do is go through and plug in each figure and work out the country's GDP for a specific year. So what what does the economy want to grow by? When we look at economic growth, it's generally considered acceptable for the rate of increase in GDP to be between 3 to 4% per year. That's what the government is aiming for, and they put in measures to achieve that, such as monetary and budgetary policy, which we're going to be looking at later in this week. So this rate allows for an increase in population, the replacement of goods and services that have been consumed, improvements and new products. Anything less than 3% is considered slow growth and suggests the economy is not keeping up with the demand for goods and services. So again, that can suggest that people aren't spending as much, or they don't have as much confidence in maybe investing, such as if you're a business and you're tossing up whether to employ a new person. Chances are, if the GDP is less than 3%, your confidence isn't going to be high, so you probably won't employ that person. So that can kind of point out there might be a bit of a recession going on. A figure above 4% is often considered to be too high. So in other words, the economy is growing too quickly and the rate of growth will not be sustainable. A sustained rate of growth means the economy is able to maintain that level over a significant period of time. So if GDP is growing too fast, it means that our demand for certain products won't be able to be met. So the supplier or the producer of that product will not be able to keep up manufacturing that product for the amount of demand. Now when that happens, you often find that prices will increase. It's what we call cost inflation. Now that's what we don't really want that. We don't want prices to go up. So we want growth to be around 3 to 4%, which means it's a sustainable rate. Just wanted to show you this. It's the economic or the business cycle. And it's a cycle that shows how most economies work. When GDP is going up, we call that a boom, or we call it a peak. Okay, for some reason or another, once it gets up high, it will generally come down a bit, because if policies aren't put in place to look after that growth, the growth will just keep going, but we don't want that. We want around 3 to 4%. So when it comes down, you're looking around a recession. When it comes to the peak of that recession, we call that a trough. On its way back up, we call that an expansion. And at the top, it can be boom or peak again. So they're just a few terms that you have to be familiar with and be able to understand this business cycle. I'd expect that you'd be able to learn this and explain it. Now we're looking at 4 limitations of using GDP as a measure of economic growth. GDP doesn't include non-market production. So say, for example, people carry out jobs around their home that could be done by a paid worker. That would be contributing to economic growth. But if I'm doing my housework, I'm cleaning my clothes, I'm ironing my clothes, I'm mowing my lawn, but I'm not getting paid for it. So that work doesn't go towards the GDP. So that's one of the limitations. It doesn't include the non-market production. Another example there, someone paints their own house. They could have paid someone to do that, but they've done it themselves. They're not getting paid for it, so that doesn't go towards the level of economic growth. GDP doesn't provide information about the distribution of production. It only measures changes in the quantity of goods and services produced, but there's no information regarding who receives this increased number of goods and services. So think about it, if more goods and services are being produced, but they're only going to the richest people in the economy, sure, GDP is going to go up, but is the economy really grown? It's an argument that people talk about. So it might be benefiting the people at the very top of the pay scale, or who can afford those items, but what about everyone else? The economy hasn't really grown. Our third one, GDP doesn't consider the impact of production on the environment. Increased production also can mean increased pollution, quicker deterioration of the environment, depletion of non-renewable resources, and increased climate change. We call these effects negative externality. So an externality is the result of a decision, and these ones would be negative. So the negative impacts, and they're considered negative outcomes of production. And our last one, GDP involves some guesstimates of production. The value of some non-marketed or not sold production making up GDP has to be guesstimated, leading to inaccuracies. For example, estimations are made for the part of a farmer's production that is consumed on the farm, as is the annual value of accommodation provided by houses occupied by their owners. This leads to inaccuracies in the GDP figure. So the farmer's doing his work, but is a guesstimate about how much is being sold, or the proportion of being sold of what he's been produced. So that being consumed on the farm has to be weighed up and can't give us an accurate figure. So there are 4 limitations of using GDP as a measure of economic growth. Guesstimates of production, doesn't include negative externalities, doesn't provide information about the distribution of production, and it doesn't include non-market production. Just recapping what else we've looked at. The economic and business cycle. We've got terms such as peak, trough, expansion. Economic growth, we want it to be about 3 to 4% per year. GDP, that's our measure of economic growth. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Why do economies need to grow? And what is economics?